Some say the world will end in fire. Some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if it had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction ice is also great and would suffice. That is Robert Frost's Fire and Ice. Very different from the last poem I did by Frost, which is The Road Not Taken, which was, I want to say, one of my first videos. But, yes, there are a lot of stylistic differences, although I suppose you could say the sort of simplicity with how he describes things is very, well, Frostian. The usual, how do I explain it? So, The Road Not Taken, Robert Frost is talking about trees and nature and the choices you make in life and stuff like that. Whereas Fire and Ice, he's talking about the end of the world, which is very different and very dark, but he's not necessarily talking about it in a dark way. He's, just very matter-of-fact of, this is what some people say, and this is what other people say, and this is how I feel about this. Even though he's talking about something as heavy as, the world ending and everyone dying and, death and destruction, just spoken about in a very light manner. Further, this poem is a lot shorter than The Road Not Taken, and I'm sure you can, this video is, thus going to be a lot shorter as well than that video. But anyway, what I mostly wanted to talk about is the sources of inspiration for this poem, because I think if you look at the sources of inspiration, it says a lot of interesting things about where writers get their inspiration from, and in that sense can be a very good example of where people draw ideas from. And I think I discussed inspiration a little bit when I read Ozymandias, but this is a little bit different. So there are two possible sources of inspiration. I don't believe either have been specifically, noted by Frost himself, but one is generally cited in his biography, which is that he must have been inspired by Dante's Inferno, because a passage in Canto 32, when Dante is observing, the worst layer of hell, the traitors, and he's been through, the higher levels of hell and fire and, fire and brimstone, all that good stuff, and he gets to the worst of the worst, and they are submerged up to their necks in ice, and it's this interesting juxtaposition between, again, fire and brimstone and freezing. So, the passage that I found that sort of gives you a little bit of an idea of this is, they were submerged in a lake so bound with ice, it did not look like water, but like a glass right clear, I saw where sinners are preserved in ice. And that last bit, where sinners are preserved in ice, I can't put my finger on it, but it sounds very similar to a poem where, sinners are preserved in ice, and talking about, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction, ice is also great and would suffice. So, saying that freezing to death is just as bad as burning to death. And the second thought source of inspiration is something that a man himself brought forth as a conversation he had had with Frost, where an astronomer, Harlow Shapley, who met with Frost at a science and the arts sort of convention, and Shapley was apparently a pretty big man of his time. So, again, not someone I've looked into or heard of, but from what I've heard, like, I think of the way people look at Neil deGrasse Tyson now, just big man of his time. They met at this Science and the Arts convention in 1960, which was, I believe, a couple years before Frost had published this poem, 1 or 2 years. But Frost asked Shapley how the world would end, and Shapley said that the world is going to end when the sun explodes, and either, one, the earth is going to, catch fire and become incinerated, or if that doesn't happen, then we will all slowly freeze in deep space. So that is another thought about where the idea comes from, and, just the idea that some say the world will end in fire, others ice, because it sounded like, again, there was no real consensus over which was more likely, over whether, the earth would be incinerated or would manage to, escape that fate, but then freeze. So I think this is interesting, in part because Shapley himself has said that he thinks this is a good example of how art can derive inspiration from science, and that is a thought that is very important to me and very close to me. I have a lot of poetry that I have written that has been inspired by science in some way, shape, or form. A lot of it from my studies of psychology or neuroscience, or and many of these poems I haven't actually read to you guys, but one that I have in that little green book of mine is a love poem about math, for example. And I know I've definitely written poems which talk about, neurons and neurotransmitters and dopamine and stuff like that. Whether they were finished or how well they turned out is, a matter of consequence, but yeah, the idea that art can derive inspiration from science is very important to me, because I am the sort of person who thoroughly enjoys both. I am half artist, half scientist, in an interesting sort of way, in the way that I think. So this story really resonates with me for that reason. Secondly, because Frost did not, according to these two theories, just derive inspiration from science. The thought that he derived inspiration from Dante's Inferno shows that he could have derived inspiration from both science and art, which is interesting. So science inspires art, but art also inspires itself, which, seems to be a little bit more obvious, because people talk all the time about works being inspired by other works, but here it's sort of a, dual lines of inspiration sort of merging into one thing, which that sort of idea makes a lot of sense to me, because much of the time I feel like works of writing and art aren't inspired by just one thing, but by connections between things. And so here he took the idea of how the world will end and took a bit of Dante's Inferno and sort of combined them into an interesting little bit about the juxtaposition with fire and ice and, you know, the end of the world and destruction and death, and all without really going into huge amounts of detail, which, again, very Frosty, and to use very few words to describe something so much and sort of make you think in that interesting way. But, yes. So, you know, you have the fire and ice juxtaposition and the science and art juxtaposition all neatly wrapped into this little story. Also interesting, which many of you may know or have picked up already, but George R.R. Martin's series, A Song of Ice and Fire, which is now generally referred to as Game of Thrones because of the TV series, that title was, at least the title, I don't know about anything else, but at the very least the title was inspired by this poem, Fire and Ice. So A Song of Ice and Fire, or Fire and Ice, which further shows how inspiration can flow through the years. Taking Dante's Inferno, combining it with, you know, this idea of how the world will end in making this poem Fire and Ice. And then Fire and Ice combined with all of the many things that must have inspired George R.R. Martin into writing his series. Again, I kind of doubt that this poem inspired his actual series of writing, but the title seems fitting in that interesting sort of, again, death and destruction, will the world end in fire or in ice kind of way, especially if you go into the whole, you know, the White Walkers or dragons. Will the world end in fire or in ice? I'm not too deep in the Game of Thrones Song of Ice and Fire series, so I can't exactly talk at length about that, but anyway, just something for you guys to think about, I suppose. And I think that'll be it for today. I'll see you guys next time.